Honest J. Nowak. Oh yeah. A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to Honest J. Nowak. So what I've got to talk about today is film franchises. Now, film franchises, of course, really strive to become one of the best known topics in human history. But mainly, I'm talking about film franchises because of the fact that at some point, only one franchise would rule them all. Currently, one of the biggest known franchises ever to exist in human life is the Avengers franchise. That has been around since 2012, and the Avengers franchise has grown to be one of the biggest things ever in history, even with the fourth Avengers film becoming the highest grossing film so far in history, topping at $500 million more than Avatar, which was at the time the highest grossing film ever made, but now Avengers Endgame managed to beat Avatar by $500 million in terms of grossing at the box office. Of course, I had been there at the times where Avengers Endgame was certainly the busiest film ever in the theaters, and it was so busy, in fact, that it was really hard to tell just how well it would be able to handle compared to other films out there. Of course, for people who have other ideas about it, though, if you want me to take you guys all the way back to the past, then of course, I'll be worthy to do so. Because going as far back, at some point where we've got ourselves the Mary Poppins franchise. Of course, the Mary Poppins franchise with the first film was pretty good, but with the second film coming out about a year ago, Mary Poppins Returns, after decades of not being around any longer, I'd say it was a pretty darn good comeback. But in terms of other franchises, though, that usually have really, really big time windows in between films, I'd say the King Kong franchise would be another pretty good exception to this. A really big exception. Mainly because of how the first King Kong film came out in 1933, and then with a sequel preceding not even a year later, and then eventually with King Kong vs. Godzilla, as in the original version. That came out 29 years after the original King Kong film. But of course, there were other King Kong films that followed it. There was a sequel to that film known as King Kong Escapes, which came out a few years after. And then there was a 1976 remake, and then a sequel that came out about 10 years after. But, of course, there was a 2005 reboot, and then we had ourselves another sort of reboot for the Legendary verse, though, in 2017. But eventually, we're going to get ourselves a brand new reboot of King Kong vs. Godzilla next year. And that is something I would really want to see. It was an amazing film from 1962. Quite a good classic right there. But the fact that we're going to get ourselves a reboot 58 years after the original one came out, it is going to be a mind blow. So many people are going to come by and are going to want to see this film. Including myself, of course, because I have been a really big fan of the Godzilla franchise. Anything from Toho or Tsuburaya. Because, I mean, that is how the Kaiju Force Neo name came to be itself. Because of my fanship in that type of, empire. But anyhow, though, of course the King Kong franchise is pretty darn good because it just manages to keep coming back even after decades of not being around. But, of course, the Godzilla franchise is also pretty good, but it does have itself even smaller time windows in between films, with the biggest being about 10 years at most. And that's mainly because of how they just want to give the character a rest, but of course the Godzilla film franchise is pretty awesome because of, having smaller time windows in order to have more films take place. But another franchise out there that usually has large time windows would be the Star Wars franchise. The Star Wars franchise, of course, started with episodes 4, 5, and 6, with having only 3-year-long time windows in between films, with the first one coming out in 1977, then with episode 5 coming out in 1980, and then in 1983 would be when the Empire, or rather episode 6 comes out. Of course, that was actually a pretty good trilogy out there, but then 16 years later, a new trilogy would end up coming around, known as the prequel trilogy. The prequel trilogy, of course, consisted of episodes 1, 2, and 3, again, with 3-year-long time windows in between films, with the first one coming out in 1999, the second from 2002, and then Revenge of the Sith from 2005. But then, after another decade-long rest of the franchise itself, we managed to get ourselves a sequel franchise, taking place after the events of Return of the Jedi. Starting in 2015 with The Force Awakens, and then eventually having ourselves The Last Jedi, and then with the upcoming Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker. It just seems that, well, mainly this sequel trilogy was trying to act as some sort of filler just to keep the franchise going. But once again, I really feel like that is actually turning out to be an okay trilogy. But, of course, compared to the original trilogy with episodes 4 through 6, that was pretty awesome. And episodes 1 through 3, they were also pretty good. But not really as good as the first trilogy. Although this new trilogy, of course, is actually pretty good too. I feel like it is in comparison to how good the prequel trilogy was. But, of course, it is the first trilogy, of course, that keeps on giving. As in how popular it was, mainly because of its age. And because at the time, the kind of visual effects and the kind of score composed by John Williams was indeed one of the greatest ever to come across. But yeah, there are so many other franchises out there I could talk about right now. I could probably talk about the Terminator series. The Terminator series, of course, started in 1984 with the first Terminator, then with a sequel in 1991, then another sequel in 2003, and then another in 2009, and we got ourselves another one in 2015, and we're going to get ourselves yet another one here in 2019, called Dark Fate. And many people were actually surprised to find out that the series itself is continuing even after the events of Judgment Day. Many people have a lot of, doubt about the series itself because it's continued to run ever since Judgment Day came out back in 1991. But now, I actually do feel like the series itself is going to continue to be really good because as long as there's more films, the series itself will continue to run and it'll consistently remind us that every franchise that continues to have new films, it's just proof that the franchises will never die. As long as they stick around, they'll never die. And the RoboCop series, of course, does have itself a similar format, with the first one coming out in 1987, then another coming in 1990, and then another one in 1993. And then, of course, there was a reboot that came out in 2014, with a few television shows coming around here and there, around those same times. But, of course, out of all franchises that I've ever had in my lifetime, I feel like that the number one pick of mine would be the Toy Story franchise. Yes. The same film that is responsible for being the first ever film to ever use computer-generated images from start to finish. Nothing that's live action, nothing that's, anything else in visual effects, no claymation, none of that other stuff. It's just CGI blended goodness. Animation of all sorts. And of course, that franchise has been something that has been a favorite of mine for about 17 years now. Ever since I was introduced to the VHS system, which I did in fact own a copy of both Toy Story 1 and Toy Story 2 on. But when Toy Story 3 came out in theaters, it was amazing. It was originally set to be the very end of the franchise itself, and there was even a sequel that was planned to come out in 2005, but that ended up getting canceled because of the company Circle 7 Animation going out of business. So that's a 2005 sequel for the Toy Story franchise we'll never get to see, unfortunately. Until someone ends up coming up with the idea to end up bringing it back and then just having it set during that time. Which I feel like would be plausible, though I might try to do some changes around here and there, though. I'll probably talk more about Toy Story later, though, here in Honest J. Nowak here. But anyhow, franchises are just series of films and television shows and otherwise that come around that just keep on giving. And I feel like that many of them will never die, no matter what we do to them. These are just series of films and television shows, if they do exist in these franchises, that will never, ever go away. We'll always have good memories with them if we saw them in the film, If we saw them in the movie theater, if we saw them on the television screen, if we saw them anywhere on YouTube or anywhere else that we normally would look up films on, then of course it's always just going to be something we'll continue to do from this point on until pretty much the end of time. They're time capsules that really showed us how awesome these films were at the time. So anyhow, I feel like that's all I got to talk about here. But I'm going to have a lot more here to talk about here on Honest J Nowak. So if you want to see more, go down to my channel. Make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.